In the late summer of 1971, Helen Marsh, a woman of 25 years with eyes that held the quiet patience of a much older soul, walked into the stifling air of the Amite County Clerk's office. The place smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that clings to buildings where hope goes to be filed away in triplicate. Behind a tall oak counter scarred with the board carvings of generations stood Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disapproval. He was the gatekeeper of the county's misfortunes, the custodian of its forgotten parcels and defaulted dreams. Helen carried a small, worn leather satchel, and in it the entirety of her inheritance, which was not land or stock, but a modest sum of cash saved over a lifetime of quiet frugality by her late father. Let me explain the situation in Amite County back then. The timber business had seen better days, and small farms were being swallowed by larger operations that ran on debt and diesel. There was a general feeling that the old ways were dying, and the only path forward was bigger, faster, and more aggressive. In the county clerk's office, a list was tacked to a corkboard, a sad collection of properties forfeited for back taxes. It was a map of local despair. Most were small, exhausted plots of farmland or tiny houses in town. But one listing was different. It was a perennial entry, a local joke that had been on and off that board for 50 years. It was listed simply as the Miller Tract, but everyone knew it as the Miller Swamp. It was several dozen acres of black water, cypress knees, and mosquito-thick air that the county considered not just worthless, but a liability. The men who loitered in the clerk's office, a permanent chorus of local wisdom, watched as Helen approached the counter. They were farmers and small-time land speculators, men who traded in acres and knew the soil of the county like the back of their own calloused hands. They saw a young woman, plain and quiet, and assumed she was there to settle a minor fee or inquire about a relative's estate. Mr. Abernathy peered over his spectacles. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. Helen's voice was soft, but clear as a bell in the quiet room. "I'm here about a property on the tax list," she said. "The Miller Tract." A low chuckle rippled through the room. It wasn't mean-spirited, not yet. It was the sound of men who knew something for an absolute fact and were amused by the naivety of someone who did not. "Mr." Abernathy allowed a thin smile to crack his stony face. "The swamp, you mean? Child, you don't want that. Nobody wants that. It's a write-off for the county, is all. Floods every spring, full of snakes. You couldn't raise a crop on it, and you can't build on it. The logging company clear-cut the good cypress 50 years ago. There's nothing left." He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man explaining a fundamental law of physics to a child. He was trying to be helpful, in his own condescending way. "I'm aware of what it is," Helen replied, her gaze steady. "I'd like to pay the back taxes and take the title." Now the laughter was no longer suppressed. One man in overalls near the door coughed loudly to cover his snort. Another shook his head, a pitying look on his face. "Mr." Abernathy took off his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief, a gesture of profound disbelief. "Miss Marsh, is it? Helen Marsh? Robert Marsh's girl?" Helen simply nodded. "Your father was a good man," Abernathy said, a hint of genuine sympathy in his voice now. "He wouldn't have wanted you throwing your money away on a mud hole. The back taxes and fees come to $94. $94 for land you can't even walk on half the year." He said the amount as if it were a fortune, and for Helen, it was. But it was also a price that signified absolute worthlessness to everyone else in the world. She did not argue. She did not defend her decision. She simply opened her satchel, took out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, and began to count out the money onto the polished counter. The bills were old and soft, mostly 5s and 10s, each one earned and saved with a purpose. The act of counting, so deliberate and silent, seemed to suck the air out of the room. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence. This was not a joke. This was real money, hard-earned, being laid down for a punchline. He was right. It was a fool's errand in their eyes. The transaction was completed with the grim finality of a funeral. Mr. Abernathy stamped the deed with a heavy thud, the sound echoing the gavel on Helen's future. As she walked out, deed in hand, she did not look back. She could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and scorn. The door swung shut behind her, and the murmurs began again, cementing the story of Marsh's folly into local legend before she had even set foot on her new property. Now, let me tell you about Helen. She was not a fool. She was an apprentice. Her father, Robert Marsh, had been a man of few words and even fewer possessions. He worked odd jobs, mending fences, trapping, guiding the occasional hunter from out of town. He never owned a deed to anything but a small boat. But he possessed a library of knowledge that wasn't written in any book. It was written in the rings of trees, the flow of water, the habits of birds, and the color of mud. He had raised Helen on the fringes of that very swamp, in a small cabin that stood on stilts. While other girls learned to sew and cook, Helen learned to read the sky for rain and the water for fish. Her father had a philosophy, a quiet and profound respect for the natural world that bordered on religion. He believed the land was not a thing to be conquered, but a partner to be understood. Most folks look at a piece of ground and see what they can take from it, he'd told her 100 times, his voice a low rumble as they poled their boat through the cypress maze. They want to drain it, clear it, flatten it, force it to be something it ain't. But that's a fight you'll always lose in the end. The land remembers what it is, long after we're gone. The secret, Helen, is to look at a place and see what it wants to be. Then you just help it along. He had taught her the swamp's secret language. He showed her how the water tupelo and black willow grew only where the current was slowest, depositing the richest sediment. He taught her to identify the subtle contours of the swamp floor, not as a flat bottom, but as a landscape of hidden channels, deep pockets, and ancient oxbows left behind by the Pearl River centuries ago. He'd pull up a handful of mud from one spot, black and rich, smelling of life. "This is food, Helen," he'd say. "This is what grows things." Then, just 20 yards away, he'd pull up another handful of gray, lifeless clay. "And this is just dirt." He taught her that the swamp wasn't a stagnant pond. It was a living, breathing system. It was a slow, powerful engine of filtration and nutrient cycling, a perfect nursery. When he passed, he left her his boat, his well-oiled traps, and that satchel of money. But his true inheritance was that way of seeing. So when Helen looked at the Miller tract on the county map, she wasn't seeing a worthless mudhole. She was seeing what her father had taught her to see. She saw the network of deep, naturally fed water channels that would keep the water fresh and oxygenated. She saw the vast deposits of nutrient-rich sediment, a free and endless supply of food for the entire aquatic food chain. She saw the existing ecosystem of insects, crawfish, and small bait fish as a foundation, not a nuisance. She saw a series of natural basins that, with a little work, could become perfect, self-contained ponds. She saw a fish farm, not one that had to be built, but one that was already there, waiting for a manager. The laughter in the clerk's office did not sting her. It affirmed her. It was the sound of men who saw only the surface, and the surface was all they believed in. Their blindness was her greatest asset. Their scorn was the reason she could buy a miracle for $94. The subsequent 2 years were a masterclass in patience and solitary labor. Helen moved into a tiny, dilapidated shack on the one sliver of high ground on the property, a small hummock her father had once called Turtleback Ridge. It was barely more than a shed, but it was dry. From there, she began her work. She did not bring in bulldozers or backhoes. She could not afford them, and more importantly, she knew they would destroy the very thing she had purchased. Her tools were an axe, a shovel, a handsaw, and her father's old flat-bottomed boat. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Not just your money, but your reputation, your time, your very future? It is a lonely and terrifying place to be. Every morning, Helen woke to the chorus of frogs and insects, a sound her neighbors heard as a nuisance, but she heard as a sign of a healthy ecosystem. She spent her days wading in the dark, cool water, often up to her waist. She wasn't draining the swamp, she was shaping it. She followed the natural contours her father had taught her to see, clearing fallen logs and debris to improve the flow in the main channels. She used a long-handled scythe to cut pathways through the overgrown vegetation, defining the borders of her future ponds. She built simple sluice gates from salvaged cypress and pine, not to block the water, but to guide it. She would open one gate to allow a pond to fill with fresh, nutrient-rich water from the main channel, then close it to let the ecosystem settle and mature. She was a conductor, orchestrating the slow, ancient music of the water. The work was brutal. The Mississippi humidity was a physical weight. The mosquitoes were a constant, tormenting cloud. She was perpetually covered in mud, her hands raw and blistered. The whispers from the nearest farms a mile down the dirt road followed her. They saw the lone figure of a young woman toiling in a swamp, and they shook their heads. "Poor Robert Marsh's girl," they'd say over the fence lines. The grief must have broke her mind. Some of the church ladies made a special trip to bring her canned goods and prayers, convinced she was destitute and starving. They couldn't comprehend that her work was an act of creation, not desperation. There was a moment, late in the second year, when she nearly broke. A massive summer thunderstorm, a real gully washer, rolled through. The rain came down in sheets for 2 days straight. The swamp, her swamp, swelled into a raging, muddy torrent. A key levee she had spent 3 months building by hand, one shovelful of mud at a time, collapsed. The water surged through, undoing a season's worth of work in a matter of hours. That night, sitting in her damp shack, listening to the roar of the water, doubt crept in. It was a cold, venomous thing. The faces from the clerk's office swam in her mind, the smirks, the pitying head shakes. "Mr." Abernathy's voice echoed in her ears. "Child, you don't want that." Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a fool, a girl playing in the mud, romanticizing her father's folksy wisdom while the real world drowned her dreams. She was exhausted, bone-tired, and utterly alone. She almost gave up. She thought about packing her few belongings and just walking away, leaving the swamp to its own devices. But then she remembered something else her father had told her, standing on a riverbank during a spring flood. "Never fight the water, Helen," he'd said. "You'll lose every time. Water has to go somewhere. Your job is to give it a better place to go than where you don't want it." He didn't see the flood as an enemy. He saw it as a force of nature that could be used. She slept, and the next morning she went out not with a shovel to rebuild the broken wall, but with her boat. She saw that the floodwaters in their fury had scoured a deep, new channel right where she had been struggling to dig one. The flood hadn't destroyed her work. It had finished it for her. It had shown her the path of least resistance she had been too stubborn to see. The land itself had corrected her mistake. That was the moment her doubt was washed away, replaced by a profound and unshakable certainty. She wasn't fighting the swamp. She was its partner. With the last of her father's money, she drove to a hatchery 3 counties over and bought 10,000 catfish fingerlings and 5,000 largemouth bass. The man at the hatchery tried to sell her fish feed, aeration pumps, and chemical treatments. Helen politely refused. "The water is right," she said simply. "It'll provide." He shrugged, taking her money but clearly thinking she was throwing it away. She released the tiny fish into her newly defined ponds, a silent prayer on her lips. And then she waited. The first sign of success was subtle. The fish didn't just survive, they vanished into the murky, food-rich water. Weeks turned into months. She managed her sluice gates, kept the channels clear, and watched. She began to see the telltale swirls of larger fish feeding near the surface at dusk. One evening, a year after stocking them, she took a simple cane pole and a worm and dropped a line into the oldest pond. The cork bobbed once, twice, then plunged underwater with a violence that nearly yanked the pole from her hands. She wrestled with it for a few minutes before pulling a magnificent, thrashing catfish onto the bank. It was nearly 3 pounds, fat and healthy, its skin gleaming. She cooked it that night over a small fire. The meat was clean, white, and sweet. It tasted of pure water and life, with none of the muddy flavor of a bottom feeder from a stagnant pool. It tasted of vindication. Word of Marsh's ponds did not spread like a wildfire, but like a slow-rising tide. It began with a man named Jebediah Stone, a notoriously grumpy old fisherman who believed all the best fishing holes were his by divine right. Convinced the public lakes were fished out, he trespassed onto Helen's property one morning, drawn by the unusual stillness and clarity of the water he could see from the road. Helen found him a few hours later, standing on the bank of her main pond, looking utterly bewildered. At his feet was a stringer so heavy with enormous base that he could barely lift it. She didn't yell. She didn't order him off. She just walked up quietly and stood beside him. "Good morning," she said. Jebediah nearly jumped out of his skin. He started to stammer an apology, an excuse, but then he just pointed at the fish. "I ain't never, in 50 years of fishing this county, I ain't never seen bass like this. Not this many. Not this big." He looked from the fish to her, his cranky face a mask of pure confusion. "How?" he asked, the single word holding a universe of questions. "The water's right," Helen said, echoing her own words from the hatchery. Jebediah stared at her, then at the pond, then back at the fish. He understood. This wasn't luck. This was something else. Can I come back?" he asked, his voice humbled. "It'll cost you $5 for the day," Helen replied, her voice calm and businesslike. Jebediah didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled bill, and pressed it into her hand. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Jebediah, for all his grumpiness, was a talker. He couldn't help but brag about his haul at the bait and tackle shop in town. He showed off the fish. He told them about the quiet woman and her impossible swamp. At first, no one believed him. They accused him of lying, of catching the fish somewhere else. So he took a friend. Then that friend took 2 more. The trickle began. Men who had spent their lives fishing the public rivers and reservoirs, complaining about declining stocks and crowded banks, started showing up at Helen's gate. She ran her business with the same quiet efficiency she ran her ponds. She set a simple, fair price. She limited the number of fishermen per day to prevent overfishing and to preserve the tranquility of the place. She designated certain ponds for certain species. There were no fancy clubhouses, no glossy brochures. There was just a hand-painted sign, a cash box, and the undeniable promise of the best fishing in the state. The same men who had chuckled in the clerk's office now found themselves waiting in line at dawn, hoping to get one of the coveted spots. They spoke her name, Helen Marsh, with a new kind of reverence. They called her ponds the Miracle Swamp. They told stories about her, myths almost, that she could talk to the fish. that she used some kind of magic. The truth was far more profound. She didn't use magic, she used knowledge. She didn't command nature, she partnered with it. Let's jump forward. By the early 1980s, Marsh's Ponds was no longer a secret. It was an institution. Helen had paid off her initial investment 1,000 times over. She lived in a small, comfortable house she had built on Turtleback Ridge, right where the old shack had been. She never took on $1 of debt. She never expanded beyond what the land could sustainably support. Her wealth wasn't flashy. It was in the health of her ponds, the freedom of being her own boss, and the deep satisfaction of being proven right. The property, once a $94 joke, was now one of the most valuable rural parcels in the county, and it wasn't for sale at any price. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 15 years after that day in the clerk's office, a dusty but well-kept sedan pulled up her long gravel driveway. An old man got out, moving stiffly. It was Mr. Abernathy. He was long retired, his hair white and thin, the permanent disapproval on his face softened into a kind of weary resignation. Helen was mending a net on her porch, her hands as nimble and sure as ever. She watched him approach, her expression unreadable. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, holding his hat in his hands. He looked around, taking in the sight. He saw the series of pristine ponds, shimmering in the afternoon sun. He saw the happy, quiet fishermen dotting the banks. He smelled the clean, earthy scent of water and woods, not the stagnant odor of a swamp. He looked at Helen, no longer a girl, but a confident woman in her prime, the master of her domain. "Miss Marsh," he began, his voice raspy with age. I don't know if you remember me. Abernathy, from the county clerk's office." "I remember you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice even. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I was driving by. I've heard the stories for years, of course, but I've never seen it for myself." He took a deep breath. "That day in the office, we all laughed. I was the loudest one. We thought you were a fool, throwing good money after bad. I told you your father wouldn't have wanted you to buy this place." He paused, and for the first time, he looked her directly in the eye. "I was wrong. I was the fool. Your father would have been proud. This is a marvel." His gaze swept across the ponds again. "I have to ask, how did you know? Everyone knew this land was worthless. How did you see this?" Helen set down her net. She looked out over the water, her water, and a small, quiet smile touched her lips. She wasn't smiling at him or at her victory. She was smiling at a memory, at the ghost of a quiet man in a flat-bottomed boat. "You said it yourself that day, Mr. Abernathy. You said I couldn't walk on it, couldn't farm it, couldn't build on it. You were right. You were all looking at the land. My father just taught me to look at the water." Abernathy stood there for a long moment, letting the simple profundity of that statement settle over him. It was an answer, a lesson, and a gentle rebuke all in one. He finally extended a trembling hand. "You've done a fine thing here, ma'am," he said. "A fine thing." Helen took his hand. The handshake was firm. It was an apology accepted, a circle closed. Decades passed. Helen Marsh became an elder, a quiet legend in a county that had once pitied her. She never married, never had children of her own. The ponds were her family, the land her legacy. She was a fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the cypress trees themselves. She saw recessions come and go, saw farms go under from debt, saw the rush for quick profits lead to ruin time and again. And through it all, she remained, solvent and serene, her livelihood drawn from the patient, steady pulse of the water. And she passed it on, not to a child of her own, but to a grandnephew, a young boy with her same quiet eyes. She took him out in the boat, just as her father had taken her. She taught him to read the currents, to know the plants, to understand the partnership. She showed him the sluice gates, the hidden channels, the rich black sediment. One afternoon, as they drifted on the main pond, now a place of pilgrimage for fishermen from across the south, she pointed to the shimmering surface. "You see that?" she asked him. "That's not just sunlight. That's the water breathing. Most people will go their whole lives and never see it. They're too busy looking for what they can build on top of it." She scooped up a handful of water and let it run through her fingers. They called this place a swamp, a worthless mud hole. They laughed because it wasn't good for cotton or for cattle, but they never stopped to ask the land what it was good for. The world will always tell you what it thinks you should be. The trick is to listen to what you are. The boy watched, absorbing the lesson, ensuring the wisdom would not die. The men in the clerk's office saw a liability. Helen saw a living system. And because she chose to honor that system instead of fighting it, the land that nobody wanted made her whole, and the water remembered her name.